Two backpackers vanished in Peruvian forest in 2009. Backpack appeared 400 kilometers away in 2024. The mountain air was crisp that April morning in 2009, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of adventure. Sarah Mitchell and Jake Harrison had been planning this hiking expedition for months, poring over topographical maps in Sarah's cramped Chicago apartment, their fingers tracing the remote trails that snaked along the Montana-Alberta border. At 25 and 27 respectively, they embodied the restless spirit of a generation that believed the world was theirs to explore, one footstep at a time. Sarah's mother, Patricia, still remembers the excitement in her daughter's voice during their last phone conversation. "Mom, you should see the pictures Jake found online," Sarah had said, her words bubbling with anticipation. "There are valleys up there that barely anyone has ever seen. We're going to document everything for the travel blog. This could be the trip that changes everything for us." Patricia Mitchell sits in her living room now, 15 years later, surrounded by photo albums and printouts from that blog, Wandering Souls, that her daughter had started with Jake just 2 years before they vanished. The blog had been gaining a modest following, attracting young adventurers who craved authentic experiences beyond the crowded tourist destinations. Sarah and Jake had positioned themselves as explorers of the hidden corners of America, places where cell phone towers couldn't reach and where the silence was so profound it seemed to echo with the whispers of an older world. The trail they had chosen for their April 2009 expedition was known only to a handful of experienced backcountry guides. The Glacier Trail, as locals called it, was an unofficial route that wended its way through some of the most isolated wilderness in the northern Rockies. Starting from a remote trailhead near East Glacier Park, it was supposed to follow ancient game paths and abandoned mining roads, eventually crossing into Alberta before looping back into Montana. The entire circuit was meant to take 10 days, with the hikers carrying everything they needed in their backpacks. But what should have been the adventure of a lifetime became every parent's worst nightmare. Patricia remembers the routine they had established for previous trips. Every evening at 6 o'clock, Sarah would send a brief text message from her satellite communicator, a small device that could send short messages even in areas without cell coverage. The messages were usually simple. "Day 3, beautiful views. All good? Love you." Sometimes Sarah would include a quick photo of their campsite or a particularly stunning vista. For the first 2 days, the messages arrived like clockwork. Day 1 brought a photo of Sarah and Jake grinning at the trailhead, their massive backpacks dwarfing their slender frames. Sarah's auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and Jake's easy smile radiated the confidence that had drawn Sarah to him in the first place. Day 2's message included a breathtaking image of a pristine alpine lake, its surface mirror still under the vast Montana sky. Then, silence. Patricia waited by her phone that third evening, watching the clock. Tick past 6, then 7, then 8. At first, she told herself there could be a simple explanation. Maybe they had decided to make camp early, or perhaps the device's battery had died. Sarah was responsible, but she was also young and sometimes got caught up in the moment. Patricia forced herself to wait until the next morning before calling the park service. "Ma'am, we get these calls more often than you might think," the ranger had said, his voice professionally calm but not unkind. "Young folks go out there and lose track of time, or their equipment fails. More often than not, they come hiking out a day or two late with stories about how they decided to explore some side trail that wasn't on their map." But when day 4 passed, then day 5, with no word from Sarah and Jake, the situation shifted from concern to alarm. Patricia drove the 12 hours from Chicago to East Glacier Park, her hands gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles went white, her mind cycling through every possible scenario. She tried to focus on the positive ones: equipment failure, a minor injury that was slowing them down, a sudden change in weather that had forced them to hunker down and wait it out. The local search and rescue coordinator, a weathered man named Tom Bradley, who had been pulling lost hikers out of the wilderness for over 20 years, met Patricia at the ranger station. His eyes held the particular kind of kindness that comes from delivering bad news too many times. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, "we've assembled a team and we're heading out first thing in the morning. The weather's been clear, so if they're out there, we'll find them." The initial search efforts were hampered by the very remoteness that had attracted Sarah and Jake to the trail in the first place. The Glacier Trail wasn't an official park route, which meant there were no regular patrols and no established checkpoints. The searchers had to rely on the rough itinerary that Sarah had emailed to her mother before leaving, a loose collection of waypoints and estimated camping locations that Jake had marked on his GPS device. Patricia joined the family base camp that Tom Bradley's team established at the trailhead. The family members began arriving. Jake's parents drove up from Denver. His sister flew in from Seattle. They huddled together in borrowed camping chairs, sharing coffee from thermoses and watching the horizon for any sign of the search helicopters that circled overhead like mechanical buzzards. The search teams found the first evidence on day 3, a campsite about 15 miles in that matched the description of where Sarah and Jake had planned to spend their second night. The site showed signs of a planned camp, a flat area where a tent had been pitched, the remains of a small campfire that had been properly extinguished, even a neat pile of rocks that someone had arranged to hold down a tarp. But there were troubling inconsistencies. Jake's GPS device was found lying in the dirt near the fire ring, its screen cracked and its battery dead. Sarah's hiking pole was discovered about 50 yards away, partially buried under fallen branches. Most disturbing of all, the searchers found scattered pieces of camping gear, a torn stuff sack, a broken water bottle, a single hiking boot that neither family could identify as belonging to their children. It looked like they'd left in a hurry, Tom Bradley told the assembled families that evening, his voice carefully neutral. "But we can't be sure what happened. Could have been a bear, could have been bad weather, could have been any number of things that made them decide to pack up fast and move on." The families clung to that possibility, that Sarah and Jake had encountered something that forced them to abandon their planned route and strike out cross-country towards safety. But as the search expanded to cover a radius of 50, then 75, then 100 square miles, hope began to give way to a terrible understanding that something had gone very wrong in the wilderness. On the 7th day of searching, the official effort was scaled back. "We've covered every realistic possibility," Tom Bradley explained to the families. "If they were injured and stationary, we would have found them by now. If they're mobile and trying to hike out on their own, they're most likely beyond our current search area. At this point, we're looking at a recovery operation rather than a rescue." Patricia felt something inside her break when she heard those words. Recovery operation. It was a euphemism that everyone understood, but no one wanted to say out loud. The search teams would continue looking, but they were no longer expecting to find Sarah and Jake alive. The families refused to accept that conclusion. Jake's father, Robert Harrison, mortgaged his house to hire a private search company that specialized in missing person cases. For 3 more weeks, teams with cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar scoured the wilderness, following every possible route the 2 lost hikers might have taken. They found nothing but false alarms, clothing that belonged to other hikers, equipment that had been lost years before, animal remains that triggered the dogs' attention. As summer turned to fall, the search efforts became increasingly sporadic. The private company ran out of leads to follow. The volunteers who had donated their weekends to the cause began returning to their regular lives. Even the media attention, which had briefly made Sarah and Jake's disappearance a regional news story, moved on to other tragedies. But Patricia Mitchell couldn't move on. She took a leave of absence from her job as an elementary school teacher and rented a small cabin near East Glacier Park. Every morning, she would drive to the trailhead and hike as far as her middle-aged legs would carry her, calling Sarah's name until her voice was hoarse, leaving trail markers and written messages in case her daughter somehow made it back to familiar ground. The other hikers and campers who encountered Patricia during those long autumn months remember her as a woman possessed by grief and hope in equal measure. She would approach anyone with a backpack, pulling out creased photographs of Sarah and Jake, asking if they had seen anything, heard anything, noticed anything unusual in the backcountry. Most people were kind, patient with her desperate questions, but Patricia could see the pity in their eyes. Winter forced Patricia back to Chicago, but she returned the following spring and the spring after that. She organized anniversary searches, coordinated with online missing person groups, and maintained Wandering Souls as a tribute to her daughter's memory and a beacon for anyone who might have information. The blog's comment section became a gathering place for other families dealing with similar losses, a community bound together by the terrible uncertainty of not knowing. Jake's family, meanwhile, chose a different path. They held a memorial service 6 months after the disappearance, accepting what the evidence seemed to suggest, that their son and Sarah had encountered some tragedy in the wilderness that would never be fully understood. "We have to let them go," Jake's mother, Linda Harrison, told Patricia. "We have to find a way to say goodbye." But Patricia couldn't say goodbye. Not when there were so many unanswered questions, not when the rational part of her mind insisted that experienced hikers, like Sarah and Jake, didn't simply vanish without leaving more substantial traces. Not when her mother's intuition whispered that her daughter was still out there somewhere, waiting to be found. The first anniversary of the disappearance came and went with a small gathering at the trailhead. Patricia, a few family friends, and 2 volunteers from the search and rescue team. They shared memories of Sarah and Jake, left flowers at the spot where the cracked GPS device had been found, and stood in silence as the wind carried their unspoken hopes across the vast wilderness. It was during that ceremony that Patricia met Margaret Dawson, a retired nurse whose own son had disappeared during a climbing expedition in Alaska 7 years earlier. Margaret had driven up from Billings after reading about the anniversary gathering on Patricia's blog. The 2 women found themselves walking back toward the parking area together, sharing the kind of conversation that only people who have lived through similar losses can truly understand. "The not knowing is the worst part," Margaret said, her voice soft but strong. "With death, at least there's closure. With this, you're suspended between hope and grief, never able to fully experience either one." Patricia nodded, feeling understood in a way she hadn't since the disappearance began. "People tell me I need to move on," she said. "They mean well, but they don't understand. How do you move on when part of you is still out there somewhere?" Margaret stopped walking and turned to face Patricia. "You don't move on," she said. "You move forward. There's a difference. Moving on means leaving them behind. Moving forward means carrying them with you while still finding a way to live." That conversation marked a subtle shift in Patricia's approach to her daughter's disappearance. She continued her searches and maintained the blog, but she also began returning to her life in Chicago for longer periods. She went back to teaching, finding solace in the daily rhythms of working with children. She joined a support group for families of missing persons, both seeking help and offering it to others. But even as Patricia learned to live with the uncertainty, she never stopped hoping for answers. She subscribed to missing person databases, followed developments in other cases, and stayed in touch with Tom Bradley and the local law enforcement agencies. Whenever hikers reported unusual finds in the backcountry, abandoned equipment, human remains, unexplained campsites, Patricia would drive back to Montana to see if it might be connected to Sarah and Jake. Most of these leads turned out to be false alarms, but they served to keep Patricia connected to the search and to maintain the awareness that had made Sarah and Jake's case a touchstone for the hiking community in the Northern Rockies. Guides and park rangers knew Patricia's story, and they kept her phone number in their contacts, ready to call if anything turned up. As the years passed, the immediate pain of loss evolved into something deeper and more complex. Patricia found herself becoming an advocate for wilderness safety, speaking at hiking clubs and outdoor gear stores about the importance of communication plans and emergency preparedness. She lobbied for better trail marking and more frequent ranger patrols in remote areas. In some ways, Sarah's disappearance had given Patricia a mission that extended beyond her personal loss. But the questions never went away. What had happened during those crucial hours after Sarah sent her last text message? Had they encountered bad weather, dangerous wildlife, or some other natural hazard that forced them off their planned route? Had they gotten lost and died of exposure in some hidden canyon where their remains might never be found? Or was there something more troubling at work, human involvement, that the original investigation had somehow missed? These questions would follow Patricia through sleepless nights and quiet moments when her mind wasn't occupied with other things. They formed the backdrop of every conversation about her daughter, every anniversary, every unexpected phone call that might bring news. The questions had become part of who Patricia was, shaping her worldview and her understanding of how quickly the familiar could become dangerous. And sometimes, late at night in her Chicago apartment, Patricia would find herself staring at the last photo Sarah had sent, that pristine alpine lake reflecting the Montana sky. She would study every detail of the image, searching for clues she might have missed, wondering what her daughter had been thinking when she took that picture. Had Sarah sensed that something was wrong? Had there been any indication of the trouble that was coming? The photo offered no answers, only the eternal silence of wilderness and the terrible knowledge that somewhere in that vast landscape, her daughter had simply vanished. The call came on a Tuesday morning in September 2010, 17 months after Sarah and Jake had disappeared. Patricia was in her classroom, helping a group of second graders practice their reading, when her phone buzzed with a call from an unfamiliar Montana number. She normally wouldn't have answered during school hours, but something about the timing, the way the call came just as she was thinking about the upcoming second anniversary of the disappearance, made her step into the hallway. "Mrs. Mitchell, this is Deputy Sheriff Craig Johnson with Glacier County. I'm calling about your daughter's case." Patricia's breath caught. After all this time, she had learned to steel herself for these calls, which usually brought news of false alarms or procedural updates. But something in the deputy's voice was different, more urgent, more hopeful than she had heard in months. "We've received a report from someone who believes they may have seen your daughter's companion last year," Deputy Johnson continued. "A man matching Jake Harrison's description was allegedly spotted in a small town called Riverfront, about 80 miles south of where they disappeared. The witness just came forward yesterday." Riverfront was barely a dot on the map, one of those high plains settlements that existed mainly to serve the ranching operations scattered across eastern Montana. The witness was a local mechanic named Bill Carpenter, who had been wrestling with his conscience for over a year before finally deciding to contact the authorities. According to Carpenter's account, in late summer of 2009, just a few months after Sarah and Jake's disappearance, a man had wandered into his garage looking for help. The stranger was disheveled, sunburned, and wearing dirty clothes that looked like they had once been high-quality outdoor gear. He had no shoes, only torn socks that were barely holding together. Most memorably, he was carrying a damaged backpack that was missing one of its main straps. He seemed confused, like he wasn't quite all there, Carpenter told Deputy Johnson. Kept asking about getting to a bus station, but he couldn't seem to remember where he was trying to go. I offered to call someone for him, but he got agitated and said he just needed directions to walk somewhere safe. What haunted Carpenter most was the man's eyes. He looked terrified, the mechanic said. Not just scared, terrified. Like something bad had happened to him and he thought it might happen again. I gave him some water and an old pair of work boots I had in the shop, and he took off walking east toward the highway. Carpenter had tried to follow up, driving along the highway for several miles, but the stranger had vanished. At the time, Carpenter assumed the man was just another drifter or perhaps someone dealing with mental health issues. It wasn't until he saw a missing person flyer for Sarah and Jake at the post office a year later that he began to wonder if the stranger might have been connected to their disappearance. The physical description Carpenter provided was tantalizingly close to Jake's vital statistics: the right height and build, similar coloring, and approximately the right age. But 17 months had passed since the encounter, and Carpenter admitted that his memory of the man's face was hazy. He had no photographs, no other witnesses, and no way to verify his account. Still, it was the first substantive lead. The investigation had received in over a year. Deputy Johnson organized a small search team to canvass the area around Riverfront, interviewing longtime residents and checking with local businesses to see if anyone else remembered the mysterious stranger. They found nothing conclusive, but several people recalled seeing an unfamiliar man walking along the highway that summer, always alone, always on foot, always seeming to avoid contact with others. The news brought Patricia racing back to Montana, her heart cycling between hope and dread. If the stranger really had been Jake, where was Sarah, and what had happened to them during those missing months between their disappearance and the alleged sighting? The timeline didn't make sense. If Jake had survived whatever befell them in the wilderness, why hadn't he sought help immediately? Why had he been wandering around eastern Montana in such an obviously distressed state? Patricia met with Bill Carpenter at his garage, studying his weathered face as he recounted his story for what must have been the 10th time in 2 days. She showed him every photograph she had of Jake, pictures from college, family gatherings, hiking trips, their last camping expedition. Carpenter studied each image carefully, his brow furrowed with concentration. "I think it could have been him," he said finally. "The height seems right and the build, but Mrs. Mitchell, the man I saw, was in rough shape, real rough. Whatever had happened to him, it had changed him. I'm not sure his own mother would have recognized him right away." The possibility that Jake had been alive months after the disappearance opened up new questions that were almost more troubling than the original mystery. If he had survived, why hadn't he contacted his family or the authorities? What had prevented him from getting help during those lost months? And most agonizingly for Patricia, if Jake had been alive, did that mean Sarah might have been too? The investigation expanded to include missing person databases across several states, looking for any other reports that might match Sarah or Jake. Deputies interviewed staff at homeless shelters, hospitals, and social service agencies, searching for records of anyone who might have been the mysterious stranger. The search area was extended to include the vast ranch lands between Glacier National Park and Riverfront, covering hundreds of square miles of sparsely populated territory. But as weeks turned into months, the expanded investigation yielded nothing more substantial than Bill Carpenter's original account. The stranger had vanished as completely as Sarah and Jake themselves, leaving only questions and the tantalizing possibility that at least one of them had survived the initial incident. that had caused their disappearance. The lack of progress was devastating for both families, but it affected them differently. Jake's parents, who had begun to find some peace in accepting their son's death, were thrown back into the acute grief of fresh uncertainty. Patricia, meanwhile, felt energized by the possibility that the case might finally be moving forward, even if the direction remained unclear. During this period, Patricia began corresponding with other families whose loved ones had gone missing in remote areas. Through online forums and support groups, she connected with people dealing with disappearances in national forests, desert wilderness areas, and mountain ranges across the country. What she discovered was both comforting and deeply unsettling. The comfort came from learning that she wasn't alone, that there were dozens of families dealing with similar mysteries, and that the emotional challenges she was facing were shared by others who understood them intimately. But the unsettling part was the pattern that seemed to emerge from these cases. Too many experienced hikers were disappearing in remote areas with little or no trace, often under circumstances that didn't quite make sense. Some of the cases involved solo hikers who had simply vanished from well-marked trails. Others concerned groups who had become separated under unclear circumstances, with some members found and others never seen again. A few involved people who had been found alive, but with no memory of what had happened to them during their time missing. Cases that reminded Patricia uncomfortably of Bill Carpenter's description of the confused stranger in Riverfront. Patricia began keeping detailed files on these cases, looking for connections and patterns that might shed light on Sarah and Jake's disappearance. She created spreadsheets tracking locations, dates, weather conditions, and outcomes. She mapped the cases geographically, looking for clusters or corridors where disappearances seemed more common. What she found was both fascinating and frightening. There did seem to be certain areas where missing person cases occurred with unusual frequency. Remote wilderness regions where the terrain was particularly challenging and where search and rescue resources were stretched thin. But more troubling were the cases where people had been found alive after extended periods missing, often with stories that made little sense and memories that seemed to have been altered or erased. These survivors typically remembered the beginning of their ordeal clearly, but had little or no recollection of how they had survived or how they had ended up where they were eventually found. Many described feeling confused and disoriented for weeks or months after their rescue, as if they had experienced some kind of trauma that their minds were working to suppress. Reading these accounts, Patricia couldn't help but think of Bill Carpenter's description of the terrified stranger who had appeared at his garage. Could Jake have been one of these confused survivors, wandering the landscape in a state of psychological trauma that prevented him from seeking help or contacting his family? The possibility was both hopeful and heartbreaking. If Jake had survived but was dealing with some form of amnesia or dissociative disorder, he might still be alive somewhere, possibly unaware of his own identity or unable to access his memories of the life he had left behind. But if that were the case, where was Sarah, and what kind of trauma could have affected them so severely? These questions led Patricia deeper into research about psychological responses to wilderness survival situations. She learned about cases where people had developed temporary amnesia after experiencing hypothermia, dehydration, or head injuries. She read about the psychological effects of prolonged isolation and the ways that extreme stress could interfere with memory formation and recall. But she also began encountering more disturbing possibilities. Through her correspondence with other families, Patricia learned about cases where missing hikers had apparently encountered other humans in remote areas, sometimes helpful, sometimes not. There were stories of people who had gotten lost and been helped by individuals or groups who turned out to have their own agendas leading to situations where the lost hikers had been held against their will or manipulated in various ways. These accounts were often incomplete and difficult to verify, but they suggested that the wilderness wasn't always the empty, neutral space that most people imagined. In some remote areas, particularly those near the margins of public lands, there were people living off the grid, some harmless, but others potentially dangerous to unprepared travelers who stumbled into their territory. The idea that Sarah and Jake might have encountered such people was deeply troubling to Patricia, but it provided a possible explanation for the scattered evidence that had been found at their campsite and the long gap between their disappearance and Jake's alleged appearance in Riverfront. If they had been taken against their will by someone living in the wilderness, it might explain the signs of hasty departure from their camp and the months of silence that followed. Patricia shared these theories with Deputy Johnson and the other law enforcement officials involved in the case, but she could tell they were skeptical. Without more concrete evidence, there was little they could do to investigate the possibility of third-party involvement. The wilderness was vast, and people living off the grid were notoriously difficult to locate and track. Still, the deputy agreed to expand the investigation to include inquiries about any known individuals or groups living in remote areas near the Glacier Trail. This led to conversations with local ranchers, hunters, and guides who might have knowledge of people camping or living long-term in areas where they weren't supposed to be. What emerged from these conversations was a clearer picture of the complex social dynamics that existed in remote wilderness areas. While most of the people encountered in the backcountry were legitimate hikers, hunters, or researchers, there were also individuals who used remote areas as refugees from various problems, legal troubles, financial difficulties, relationship, conflicts, or mental health issues. Some of these people were essentially harmless, modern hermits who simply preferred isolation to the complications of conventional society. But others were more problematic, including people who were actively avoiding law enforcement or who had developed paranoid or antisocial tendencies during their time in isolation. Local guides reported occasional encounters with camps that seemed too permanent or too elaborate for normal backpacking activities. Rangers mentioned finding evidence of long-term habitation in areas where camping was restricted or prohibited. Hunters described meeting individuals in the wilderness who seemed evasive or hostile when questioned about their presence in the area. None of these reports directly connected to Sarah and Jake's disappearance, but they painted a picture of a landscape that was less empty and more socially complex than most hikers realized. For Patricia, this knowledge added another layer of worry to her concerns about what might have happened to her daughter. As 2010 turned to 2011, the investigation into Bill Carpenter's sighting gradually stalled. Despite extensive searches and interviews, no additional evidence emerged to support or refute his account. The mysterious stranger he described remained as elusive as Sarah and Jake themselves, leaving the families with tantalizing possibilities but no concrete answers. The lack of progress was exhausting for everyone involved, but Patricia found herself unable to let go of the hope that Carpenter's sighting represented. If Jake had been alive in 2009, there was at least a chance that he might still be alive somewhere, possibly still struggling with whatever trauma had left him wandering confused through eastern Montana. Patricia began making regular trips to Riverfront and the surrounding area, visiting shelters and social service agencies, distributing flyers with Sarah and Jake's photographs, and talking to anyone who would listen about the possibility that two missing hikers might still be alive somewhere in the region. Most people were sympathetic but had nothing useful to offer. A few thought they might have seen someone matching the descriptions, but the details were always too vague or too distant in time to be meaningful. During one of these trips, Patricia met Father Martinez, a Catholic priest who ran a small mission in a town about 30 miles from riverfront. The mission provided meals and temporary shelter for transient people, including some who might be trying to avoid official attention for various reasons. Father Martinez listened carefully to Patricia's story and studied the photographs she showed him. "I see many people who are running from something," he told her. "Sometimes they're running from the law, sometimes from their families, sometimes from their own memories. The ones who are running from memories, those are the hardest cases. They often don't even know what they're running from." Father Martinez promised to keep Sarah and Jake's photographs at the mission and to contact Patricia if anyone matching their descriptions ever sought help there. It was a small comfort, but it represented one more set of eyes watching for any sign that Patricia's daughter and her companion might still be alive somewhere in the vast landscape of the American West. As Patricia drove back to Chicago after that trip, she found herself thinking about the strange turns her life had taken since Sarah's disappearance. She had become an amateur investigator, a missing persons advocate, and a student of wilderness psychology. She had learned more about the dark possibilities lurking in remote places than she had ever wanted to know. But she had also discovered reserves of strength and determination that she hadn't known she possessed. The mystery of Sarah and Jake's disappearance had changed her fundamentally, but it hadn't broken her. If anything, it had given her a sense of purpose that extended beyond her own personal loss. Through her blog and her advocacy work, she had helped other families navigate similar crises. She had contributed to discussions about wilderness safety and search protocols. She had kept alive the hope that missing people could still be found, even years after they had vanished. But as she watched the Montana landscape disappear in her rearview mirror, Patricia couldn't escape the feeling that she was missing something important, some crucial piece of information that would make sense of all the scattered clues and conflicting possibilities that had emerged over the past 2 years. The answer was out there somewhere, she was certain of that. The question was whether she would recognize it when she finally found it. The years that followed Bill Carpenter's reported sighting were marked by a series of false hopes and crushing disappointments. Every few months, someone would come forward with the claim of having seen Sarah or Jake, a waitress in Billings who thought she recognized Sarah from a photograph, a gas station attendant near the Canadian border who remembered serving someone who looked like Jake, a social worker in Missoula who had encountered a confused young woman who couldn't remember her own name. Each report sent Patricia racing across the state, her heart pounding with the possibility that this time might be different. But every dissolved under scrutiny, leaving behind only the familiar ache of renewed hope followed by crushing disappointment. Still, Patricia investigated each one thoroughly, unable to risk missing the one genuine sighting that might lead her back to her daughter. It was during this period of persistent searching that Patricia began to notice disturbing patterns in the stories she was hearing. Too many people in the region had tales of strange encounters in remote areas, hikers who had gotten lost and been helped by individuals who seemed to know the wilderness unusually well, campers who had been approached by people who seemed to be living permanently in areas where long-term residence wasn't permitted, travelers who had accepted assistance from locals only to find themselves in situations that felt uncomfortable or threatening. Most of these stories ended without serious harm, but they suggested a hidden population of people who moved through the wilderness with purposes and agendas that weren't immediately apparent to casual visitors. Patricia began collecting these accounts, looking for patterns that might shed light on what had happened to Sarah and Jake. The breakthrough she had been hoping for finally came. In 2015, 6 years after the disappearance, from an unexpected source, a local man named Frank Whitefeather, who worked seasonally as a hunting guide, approached Deputy Johnson with a story he had been reluctant to tell for years. Frank was part Blackfeet and had grown up in the area around Glacier National Park. He knew the wilderness as well as anyone alive, and he had noticed things over the years that troubled him. Evidence of people living in remote areas where they shouldn't be. Signs of activities that didn't match the normal patterns of hunting, fishing, or recreation. "There's been people out there for years," Frank told the deputy. "Not just passing through, living there, building things, staying put. Some of them don't want to be found, and some of them don't want other people found either." Frank's account was both more specific and more disturbing than anything Patricia had heard before. According to him, there was a loosely organized group of people who had been using remote areas of the wilderness as a base for various illegal activities, not major crimes, but things like growing marijuana, distilling alcohol, and providing a refuge for people who were avoiding law enforcement for minor offenses. What made this group particularly dangerous, Frank explained, was their attitude toward hikers and campers who accidentally discovered their operations. While they usually just scared people away with threats, there had been cases where they had detained visitors who they felt posed a threat to their security. "Most folks who stumble into their area just get run off," Frank said. "But sometimes, if they think someone might report them to the authorities, they might hold them for a while until they figure out what to do. And sometimes people who get held like that don't come back the same as they went in." Frank's reluctance to come forward earlier had been based on his knowledge that some members of this group were local people, individuals he had grown up with or was related to through the complex web of family connections that characterized rural communities. But the weight of keeping the secret had finally become too much for him to bear. The information Frank provided led to the most significant development in the case since the original disappearance. Working with federal agencies that had jurisdiction over the public lands involved, local law enforcement organized a carefully planned operation to investigate the remote areas Frank had identified. What they found exceeded their worst expectations. Hidden in a canyon about 25 miles from where Sarah and Jake had last been seen, they discovered an elaborate network of camouflage structures, cabins, storage buildings, and workshops that had been constructed over several years, with materials that had obviously been carried in by hand or pack animal. The site showed signs of recent occupation, but it was currently empty. However, searchers found evidence that people had been held there against their will. Improvised sleeping areas that looked more like cells than campsites, restraints fashioned from rope and wire, and most disturbing of all, personal items that belonged to people who had been reported missing over the past several years. Among those items was a passport that belonged to Jake Harrison. The passport was found in a wooden box, along with identification documents belonging to 3 other people who had disappeared in the region during the previous decade. The documents were charred around the edges, as if someone had tried to burn them but hadn't completed the job. Jake's passport showed signs of having been exposed to weather and rough handling, but his photograph was still clearly visible. Patricia received the call about the discovery while she was at work, teaching a reading lesson to her 3rd grade class. Deputy Johnson's voice was carefully controlled as he explained what the search team had found, but Patricia could hear the mix of triumph and dread beneath his professional tone. "Mrs. Mitchell, we found evidence that confirms your daughter and Mr. Harrison were taken to this location," he said. "We're treating this as a kidnapping case now, and we've got federal agents involved. I need you to understand that what we're dealing with is more serious than we originally thought." The discovery of the hidden camp transformed the investigation from a missing persons case into a criminal investigation involving multiple agencies. FBI agents specializing in kidnapping cases were brought in to analyze the site and coordinate the manhunt for the people who had operated it. The evidence suggested that the group had been active for several years, targeting not just Sarah and Jake, but other hikers and campers who had ventured into their territory. Patricia felt a strange mixture of relief and terror at this development. On one hand, the discovery of Jake's passport confirmed that their disappearance hadn't been a simple case of getting lost in the wilderness. There were answers to be found, and people who could be held accountable. On the other hand, the implications of what might have happened to Sarah and Jake during their time at that hidden camp were almost too terrible to contemplate. The FBI agents were professional but honest about the challenges they faced. The people who had operated the camp had clearly had advance warning that law enforcement was closing in. The site had been hastily abandoned, with attempts made to destroy evidence and remove anything that might provide leads to their current whereabouts. These people know the country extremely well, Agent Sarah Collins explained to Patricia during a briefing at the Glacier County Sheriff's Office. They've been living off the grid for years, and they have resources and hiding places that we're only beginning to understand. Finding them is going to take time. The search for the group responsible for the camp became a priority for multiple law enforcement agencies, but it quickly became apparent that they were dealing with people who were skilled at avoiding detection. The wilderness where they operated covered hundreds of square miles, much of it accessible only on foot or horseback. There were countless places where someone could hide, and the group had demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of surveillance techniques and law enforcement procedures. Meanwhile, Patricia struggled with the emotional impact of finally having concrete evidence about what had happened to Sarah and Jake. The uncertainty that had defined her life for the past 6 years had been replaced by the knowledge that her daughter had been the victim of a crime. But that knowledge came with its own agonizing questions. Had Sarah and Jake been held at that camp for days, weeks, or months? What had their captors done to them during that time? Were they still alive somewhere? Or had they been killed when they were no longer useful to their captors? The burned identification documents suggested that the group had a systematic approach to disposing of evidence related to their victims, but they didn't provide clear answers about what had ultimately happened to the people those documents belonged. Dubril, Agent Collins tried to prepare Patricia for the possibility that the investigation might not lead to the recovery of Sarah and Jake, even if their captors were eventually apprehended. The people we're dealing with have shown a pattern of eliminating evidence, she explained. If your daughter and Mr. Harrison are no longer alive, their remains might never be found. But the agent also held out hope that some of the victims might still be alive. We've seen cases where kidnapping groups keep some victims for extended periods, she said. Sometimes they're used as forced labor, sometimes they're held for other reasons. If your daughter and Mr. Harrison are still alive, finding and arresting their captors is the best chance we have of bringing them home. The investigation expanded to include a review of all missing person cases in the region going back 10 years. What emerged was a pattern of disappearances that had been scattered across multiple jurisdictions and had never been connected before. Young hikers, in particular, seemed to have been targeted by the group. People who were fit enough to be useful as forced labor and isolated enough that their disappearance might not trigger immediate, large-scale searches. Patricia found herself at the center of a network of families who were dealing with similar losses. Parents, siblings, and partners of missing hikers began reaching out to her, sharing their stories, and hoping that the breakthrough in Sarah and Jake's case might lead to answers about their own loved ones. The connections Patricia had made through her blog and advocacy work suddenly took on new urgency and importance. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of these connections was learning how many families had been struggling with the same questions and uncertainties that had dominated Patricia's life for the past 6 years. Too many people had vanished in remote areas under circumstances that suggested something more than simple accidents or natural disasters. but law enforcement agencies had lacked the resources or coordination to identify the patterns that connected these cases. The discovery of the hidden camp had revealed that at least some of these disappearances were connected, but it also raised troubling questions about how many other such operations might exist in remote areas across the country. The group that had targeted Sarah and Jake had operated with impunity for years, suggesting that the wilderness provided more opportunities for criminal activity than most people realized. As the investigation continued, Patricia found herself learning more about the psychology and methodology of the people who had taken her daughter than she had ever wanted to know. According to the FBI profilers, the group appeared to have been motivated primarily by the desire to maintain their illegal operations rather than by any specific hostility toward their victims. The hikers they had targeted were simply people who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, witnesses who posed a potential threat to the group's security. This knowledge was both comforting and disturbing. It suggested that Sarah and Jake hadn't been targeted personally, which meant their capture had been a matter of bad luck rather than any action they had taken. But it also meant that their fate had been determined by people who viewed them primarily as problems to be solved rather than as human beings with families who loved them. The manhunt for the group continued through the summer and fall of 2015, with law enforcement agencies coordinating searches across a multi-state area. There were occasional sightings and false alarms, but the group seemed to have vanished as completely as their victims had. The wilderness that had hidden their operations for years was now protecting them from the consequences of their crimes. Patricia spent much of this period in Montana, staying in a small apartment in Kalispell and visiting the Investigation Command Center daily. She had taken another leave of absence from teaching, unable to focus on anything other than the possibility that the people who had taken Sarah might finally be brought to justice. During one of these visits, Agent Collins shared a piece of information that provided both hope and additional anguish. Hidden among the evidence found at the camp, investigators had discovered a journal that contained partial records of the people who had been held there. The entries were cryptic and obviously written in code, but FBI analysts had been able to decipher enough to confirm that Sarah and Jake had been among the victims. More importantly, the journal entries suggested that at least some of the people held at the camp had been moved to other locations rather than killed immediately. There were references to transfers and relocations that implied a network of sites rather than a single operation. "We think your daughter might have been moved from this camp to another location," Agent Collins told Patricia. The journal suggests that the group had multiple sites, and they sometimes moved people between them. If that's the case, Sarah and Mr. Harrison might still be alive somewhere. This possibility was both thrilling and terrifying for Patricia. If Sarah was still alive after all these years, what condition might she be in? How might prolonged captivity have affected her physically and psychologically? And if the group had multiple sites, how long might it take law enforcement to find and investigate all of them? The investigation had provided answers to some of the questions that had tormented Patricia for years, but it had also opened up new uncertainties that were equally difficult to bear. She now knew that Sarah had been the victim of a crime rather than a wilderness accident, but she still didn't know whether her daughter was alive or dead, or what she might have endured during her captivity. As winter approached and the active search operations were scaled back due to weather, Patricia found herself facing a new kind of waiting. No longer the open-ended uncertainty of not knowing what had happened, but the specific agony of knowing that somewhere the people responsible for her daughter's disappearance were still free, and that Sarah's ultimate fate remained unknown. The case had become national news, with media attention focused on the implications of organized criminal activity in remote wilderness areas. But for Patricia, the publicity was secondary to the simple hope that someone, somewhere, might recognize the faces of the people law enforcement was seeking, or might have information that could lead to the discovery of other sites where victims might be held. She had spent 6 years learning to live with uncertainty, but this new phase of the investigation required different emotional skills. Now she had to find a way to maintain hope while acknowledging the possibility that even if the criminals were caught, it might be too late to save the people they had taken. The winter of 2015-2016 passed slowly, with Patricia dividing her time between Montana and Chicago, staying close enough to the investigation to receive updates, but trying to maintain some semblance of normal life while the search continued. The emotional toll of the new developments had been enormous, but it had also given her something she hadn't had in years, a clear sense that the case was moving towards some kind of resolution, even if she couldn't yet see what that resolution might be. The call that would change everything came on a gray morning in May 2024, nearly 15 years after Sarah and Jake had first disappeared into the Montana wilderness. Patricia was in her kitchen, preparing for another day of teaching, when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. After years of false alarms and disappointments, she had learned to approach such calls with cautious hope rather than immediate excitement. "Mrs. Mitchell, this is Agent Collins with the FBI. We've found something important, and I need you to sit down." The discovery had been made by a ranch worker named Miguel Santos, who was checking fence lines on a remote cattle operation about 400 miles southeast of where Sarah and Jake had originally disappeared. The ranch covered thousands of acres of high desert country in eastern Montana, the kind of empty landscape where a person could walk for days without seeing another human being. Miguel had been repairing a section of fence damaged by winter storms when he noticed something unusual, partially buried under a pile of deadfall branches that had been deposited by spring runoff. The bright blue color of a backpack strap had caught his eye, leading him to investigate what appeared to be camping equipment that had been abandoned or lost. What Miguel found was a hiking backpack in remarkably good condition, considering it had apparently been exposed to the elements for an extended period. The pack was a deep navy blue, expensive looking, and when he opened it he discovered personal items that suggested it had belonged to a serious hiker. High-quality outdoor gear, a water filtration system, energy bars that were years past their expiration date, and most significantly, a camera and a water-resistant journal. Miguel immediately contacted his supervisor, who recognized the potential importance of the find and called the Glacier County Sheriff's Department. The backpack was quickly identified as having belonged to Sarah Mitchell based on personal items found inside and serial numbers on some of the equipment. But it was the location of the discovery that proved most significant. The ranch where Miguel had found the backpack was more than 400 miles from where Sarah and Jake had disappeared, across terrain that included major highways, towns, rivers, and mountain ranges. There was no conceivable hiking route that could have taken them from their last known location to where the backpack was found, at least not through wilderness alone. Agent Collins explained the implications to Patricia over the phone, her voice carefully controlled, but unable to hide her excitement at this breakthrough. "Mrs. Mitchell, the location where your daughter's backpack was found suggests that she was transported there by vehicle. This supports our theory that she and Mr. Harrison were taken by the group we've been tracking. More importantly, we've recovered some items that might help us understand what happened to them." The camera found in Sarah's backpack had been protected by a waterproof case, and its memory card was still intact. When FBI technicians examined the images, they found photographs that told the story of Sarah and Jake's last days of freedom in heartbreaking detail. The early photos showed the young couple in high spirits, documenting their progress along the glacier trail with the enthusiasm that had characterized all their previous adventures. They had captured stunning landscapes, candid moments around their evening campfires, and the easy camaraderie that had made them such effective travel bloggers. But the final images on the camera told a different story. The last few photographs were taken in what appeared to be a clearing, surrounded by crude buildings, structures that didn't match anything found in the hidden camp that had been discovered in 2015. These buildings looked more permanent, suggesting a larger and more established operation than investigators had previously uncovered. Most disturbing of all, the final photographs showed other people in the background, individuals who were clearly not hikers or campers. Some appeared to be armed, and their body language suggested they were guarding or controlling the situation rather than participating in a friendly encounter. The last image on Sarah's camera was a blurry, tilted shot that appeared to have been taken hastily, showing what looked like several people approaching the camera position. The image was dark and unclear, but it conveyed a sense of fear and urgency that made it difficult for Patricia to look at. These photographs confirm that your daughter and Mr. Harrison encountered other people during their hike, Agent Collins explained to Patricia during a briefing at the FBI field office in Great Falls. The images suggest that this encounter was not friendly, and that Sarah was able to take some pictures before their camera was taken away from them. The journal found in the backpack provided additional clues about Sarah and Jake's experience. Sarah had been keeping detailed notes about their daily progress, weather conditions, and the wildlife they encountered. But the final entries showed increasing concern about other people they had noticed in the area. The last entry, dated 3 days after their final text message to Patricia, was written in Sarah's familiar handwriting, but with obvious signs of stress. "We keep seeing smoke from fires that aren't on any trail maps. Jake thinks we should change our route, but we're not sure which direction is safe. Someone has been watching us. We found fresh footprints around our camp this morning that weren't there when we went to sleep. We're going to try to reach the ranger station, but we might have to go cross-country to avoid whoever is out here." The journal entry ended abruptly, suggesting that Sarah and Jake had been taken shortly after she wrote those words. For Patricia, reading her daughter's final written thoughts was almost unbearably painful, but it also provided confirmation that Sarah had been aware of the danger they were facing and had been trying to find a way to safety. The discovery of the backpack triggered the most intensive phase of the investigation yet. FBI teams descended on the area where Miguel Santos had made his find, using ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and aerial surveillance to search for any additional evidence. The ranch operation was cooperative, providing access to their records and helping investigators understand how someone might have traveled to such a remote location. What emerged from this expanded search was evidence of a much larger criminal network than anyone had previously imagined. The high desert country of eastern Montana was dotted with abandoned homesteads, unused mining claims, and sections of public land that were rarely visited by anyone except occasional hunters or ranchers. It was ideal territory for people who wanted to operate outside the reach of law enforcement. Investigators found evidence of multiple campsites and temporary structures scattered across a huge area, suggesting that the group responsible for taking Sarah and Jake had been highly mobile and had access to vehicles that could navigate rough terrain. They also found indications that the operation had been active for much longer than anyone had suspected, possibly dating back decades rather than just the few years that law enforcement had been aware of it. The search also revealed something. that gave Patricia the first real hope she had felt in years. At one of the abandoned campsites, investigators found recent evidence of human habitation, food containers with dates from the previous year, medications that suggested ongoing medical care, and personal items that indicated people had been living at the site within the past 12 months. "We think some of the victims may still be alive," Agent Collins told Patricia during a briefing that had the feel of a war council. "The evidence suggests that this group has been using forced labor for various activities, and they appear to have been keeping some people for extended periods. Your daughter and Mr. Harrison may have been held at multiple locations over the years." This possibility was both thrilling and terrifying for Patricia. If Sarah had been alive all these years, what condition might she be in after more than a decade of captivity? How might such an experience have affected her physically and psychologically? And perhaps most importantly, were the people responsible for taking her, still holding her somewhere in the vast wilderness of eastern Montana? The investigation expanded to include specialists in hostage recovery and psychological trauma, recognizing that any victims who were eventually found would likely need extensive support to readjust to normal life. Patricia found herself working with counselors and social workers who tried to prepare her for the possibility that even if Sarah was found alive, she might be very different from the young woman who had disappeared 15 years earlier. The manhunt intensified through the summer of 2024, with multiple agencies coordinating searches across a 3-state area. The discovery of Sarah's backpack had provided investigators with new leads about the group's methods and territory, but it had also revealed the enormous scope of the operation they were trying to uncover. Progress came in small increments. A gas station attendant in a tiny town near the Wyoming border remembered selling fuel to someone driving a modified truck that matched descriptions provided by investigators. A rancher reported seeing lights and hearing vehicles in areas where no legitimate activity should have been taking place. Slowly, law enforcement began to piece together a network of routes and locations that the criminal group had been using for years. The breakthrough came in late September when a joint task force of FBI agents and local law enforcement surrounded a compound hidden in a remote canyon about 50 miles from where Sarah's backpack had been found. The operation was conducted at dawn, with agents approaching the site from multiple directions to prevent anyone from escaping into the surrounding wilderness. What they found exceeded everyone's expectations. The compound consisted of several well-constructed buildings that had clearly been in use for years. There were workshops, storage facilities, living quarters, and most importantly, structures that had obviously been used to confine people against their will. 7 people were found at the compound when agents moved in. 3 were members of the criminal group who were immediately arrested, but 4 were victims who had been held there for varying lengths of time. The victims were malnourished, traumatized, and in need of immediate medical attention, but they were alive. Sarah Mitchell was not among them. The rescued victims were transported to a secure medical facility where they could receive treatment. While being debriefed by investigators, their accounts provided the clearest picture yet of what Sarah and Jake had experienced after their capture 15 years earlier. According to the victims, the group had operated multiple sites over the years, moving people between them based on their labor needs and security concerns. People who were captured were typically held for several years before being moved to more remote locations, or in some cases, released in areas far from where they had been taken, often with threats that prevented them from contacting law enforcement. The rescued victims reported that they had known of other captives who had been held at various times, including a young woman and man who matched Sarah and Jake's descriptions. But those particular captives had been moved to a different location several years earlier, and the rescued victims didn't know what had ultimately happened to them. The arrested members of the group were not immediately cooperative with investigators, but the evidence found at the compound was extensive. Records kept by the group documented their activities over more than 2 decades, including references to dozens of people who had been taken from various locations across the western United States. Among these records, investigators found specific mentions of Sarah and Jake, confirming that they had been held at multiple locations between 2009 and 2018. The records indicated that they had been moved frequently, sometimes for security reasons, and sometimes because their captors needed labor for different types of activities in various locations. The most recent entries about Sarah and Jake dated to 2018, when they had apparently been transferred to what the records described as a long-term facility in an area identified only by a set of coordinates. The coordinates pointed to a location in the remote mountains along the Montana-Idaho border, in territory so isolated that it would require a major expedition just to reach it. Patricia received this information during a briefing that felt like both a victory and a devastating defeat. After 15 years of uncertainty, she finally had confirmation that Sarah had survived the initial capture and had been alive as recently as 6 years earlier. But the location where she might now be held was so remote and challenging that reaching it would require careful planning and considerable resources. "We're organizing an expedition to investigate those coordinates," Agent Collins told Patricia. "The terrain is extremely difficult, and it's going to take time to plan an approach that won't endanger our people or any victims who might be at the location. But Mrs. Mitchell, I want you to understand that we're going to find your daughter." The expedition to the coordinates found in the group's records was mounted in early October, with FBI hostage rescue specialists working alongside search and rescue teams who knew the mountain wilderness of the Montana-Idaho border. The terrain was as challenging as investigators had feared: steep, heavily forested, and accessible only by helicopter or several days of hiking through territory where weather conditions could change rapidly. When the teams finally reached the coordinates, they found another compound, this one larger and more established than any they had discovered previously. The site included substantial buildings that had clearly been constructed for long-term occupation, along with infrastructure that suggested the group had been planning to operate there indefinitely. But like the other sites, this compound had been recently abandoned. The buildings were empty, and attempts had been made to destroy evidence and remove anything that might provide leads to the group's current whereabouts. However, the site had been abandoned so recently that investigators found warm ashes in fireplaces and food that was still fresh in storage areas. More importantly, they found clear evidence that people had been held there against their will as recently as a few weeks earlier. Personal items belonging to multiple individuals were discovered, along with letters and journals that documented the experiences of people who had been confined at the site for years. Among these items were letters written by Sarah Mitchell. The letters, addressed to her mother but never sent, documented Sarah's experiences during more than a decade of captivity. Written on scraps of paper and hidden in various locations around the compound, they told the story of a young woman who had endured unimaginable hardships while never giving up hope that she would eventually be rescued or find a way to escape. Reading her daughter's words after 15 years of silence was overwhelming for Patricia. The letters revealed that Sarah had maintained her essential character and spirit despite everything she had endured. She wrote about other captives she had met, about small acts of kindness that had helped her survive, and about her determination to someday return to the life and family she had left behind. The most recent letter was dated just 3 weeks before the compound was discovered. In it, Sarah wrote about rumors among the captives that the authorities were getting close and that they might be moved again soon. She also mentioned Jake, confirming that he had been with her for most of their captivity but had been separated from her several months earlier. "I don't know where they took Jake," Sarah had written, "but I'm hoping it means they're releasing some of us. I dream about seeing you again, Mom. I dream about going home. I know you've been looking for me all these years, and I want you to know that thinking about you has kept me going when everything else seemed impossible." The discovery of Sarah's letters confirmed that she had been alive until very recently, but it also revealed that the criminal group had learned about the investigation closing in on them and had moved their remaining captives to yet another location. The race to find Sarah and the other victims had become more urgent than ever. Federal agencies mobilized every available resource for what they recognized might be their last chance to rescue the remaining victims before the group disappeared entirely, or decided that holding captives had become too dangerous. Helicopters, drone surveillance, and specialized tracking teams were deployed across a vast area of wilderness, following every possible lead and investigating every structure or settlement that might be hiding the group's final stronghold. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of the victims who had been rescued from the earlier compound remembered overhearing conversations about a winter place where the group had planned to relocate if their other sites were compromised. The location wasn't clearly described in the group's written records, but the rescued victim remembered enough details to help investigators narrow their search area. Acting on this information, search teams focused on a particularly remote section of the Bitterroot Mountains, where harsh winter conditions would require substantial shelter and preparation. After 3 days of intensive searching, they located what appeared to be the group's final refuge, a collection of underground bunkers and camouflaged buildings hidden in a valley so isolated that it had never appeared on any official maps. The operation to approach this final location was the most complex and dangerous of the entire investigation. The group had clearly chosen the site for its defensive advantages, and there was evidence that they were prepared to resist any rescue attempt. FBI hostage rescue specialists worked with military advisors to develop an approach that would maximize the chances of rescuing victims while minimizing the risk of violence. The assault on the final compound took place on a snowy morning in late October 2024. Multiple teams approached the site from different directions, using the element of surprise and overwhelming force to prevent the criminals from harming their remaining captives. The operation was over in less than an hour, with all members of the criminal group captured and 11 victims successfully rescued. Sarah Mitchell was among them. When Patricia first saw her daughter at the secure medical facility where the rescued victims were being treated, she almost didn't recognize the woman Sarah had become. 15 years of captivity had changed her physically. She was thinner, scarred, and marked by experiences that no one should have to endure. But her eyes were still the same, and when she saw Patricia, Sarah's face broke into the smile that her mother had been dreaming about for 15 years. "I knew you'd find me, Mom," Sarah said, her voice hoarse from years of limited use, but still unmistakably hers. "I never stopped believing that you were looking for me." The reunion was overwhelming for both women, a mixture of joy, relief, and grief for all the years that had been lost. Sarah was alive, but she was also deeply traumatized and would need extensive support to readjust to the world she had been taken from so long ago. The young woman who had set out on a hiking adventure in 2009 had survived experiences that would have broken many people, but she had also been forever changed by them. Jake Harrison was among the other rescued victims. though he was in worse condition than Sarah, both physically and psychologically. The years of captivity had affected him more severely, and his recovery would be even more challenging. But he was alive, and his family was able to experience the same mixture of joy and heartbreak that Patricia felt when she was reunited with Sarah. The criminal group that had stolen 15 years from these people was finally in custody, facing charges that would ensure they never had the opportunity to harm anyone else. The investigation had revealed the scope of their operation. Dozens of victims over more than 2 decades, multiple compounds across several states, and a level of organization that had allowed them to operate undetected for far too long. But for Patricia, the legal proceedings and the broader implications of the case were secondary to the simple miracle of having her daughter back. Sarah was alive, she was home, and she was slowly beginning the long process of healing from trauma that no one should have to endure. The recovery process would be difficult and lengthy. Sarah would need medical treatment, psychological counseling, and time to readjust to a world that had changed dramatically during her absence. Social media, smartphones, and countless other innovations that had emerged during her captivity were as foreign to her as if she had traveled to another planet. But she had survived, and she had never given up hope. The spirit that had made her such an enthusiastic traveler and blogger was still there, buried under years of trauma, but not destroyed. With time, support, and love, Patricia believed that spirit could be restored. As she sat beside Sarah's hospital bed, watching her daughter sleep peacefully for the first time in 15 years, Patricia thought about all the people who had helped make this moment possible. The searchers who had never stopped looking, the investigators who had refused to give up, the other families who had shared their own losses and hopes, and the countless individuals who had kept Sarah and Jake's story alive when it would have been easier to forget. The nightmare was over, but the healing was just beginning. Sarah was home, and that was enough. After 15 years of uncertainty, of false hopes and crushing disappointments, of searching and waiting and never quite giving up, Patricia finally had her daughter back. The wilderness had taken Sarah away, but love, determination, and the refusal to surrender to despair had brought her home. It was a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, even when hope seems foolish and faith seems impossible, the human capacity for resilience and love can overcome the most terrible obstacles. Sarah was alive. She was home. And that was everything. If this story has touched your heart the way it has touched mine, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about the power of never giving up hope. Leave a comment below, telling us about your own experiences with loss, hope, or the people who never stop believing in you. These stories matter because they remind us that behind every missing person case is a family that refuses to stop loving, stop searching, and stop believing. In a world that often feels dark and hopeless, Patricia and Sarah's story shows us that love really can conquer the impossible. Thank you for being part of this community that believes in bringing people home.